The chair that suddenly went empty. Ryan Clark was analyzing the NFL one moment and before the cameras returned from commercial. His 11-year ESPN career was reportedly over. There was no farewell package, no carefully prepared announcement, no final message to the audience that had watched him grow from a former defensive back into one of football television's most recognizable voices. When NFL Live returned from its commercial break on Monday, July 20, Clark was simply no longer sitting at the desk. That empty chair immediately became more powerful than anything ESPN could have said. According to multiple reports, ESPN originally intended to inform Clark the following morning as part of a broader round of personnel cuts. But once reporters began asking questions, executives feared the news would reach him online before the company spoke to him directly. The decision was accelerated, and Clark learned his time at ESPN was ending while he was still participating in the program. He did not finish the broadcast. Think about how brutal that timing was. Clark had entered the studio expecting to debate football, evaluate players, and prepare fans for another NFL season. Instead, during an ordinary commercial break, the conversation shifted from football to his own future. Viewers initially had no explanation. His colleagues had to continue the show. The cameras kept rolling. But online, the story exploded before the broadcast had even ended. And that was only the beginning, because as the details surfaced, the biggest question was no longer whether ESPN had removed Ryan Clark. The question became why one of the network's most prominent NFL analysts had been placed in such an uncomfortable position, and whether the company's explanation told the entire story. Before we uncover the pressure, the money, the merger, and the personal tensions behind this stunning exit, tell us where you are watching from. If you believe Clark deserved a private and respectful conversation, press 1 inch the comments. If you believe ESPN had the right to act immediately, press 2 and subscribe. Because the truth behind that empty chair becomes even more complicated from here. A decision that could not stay secret. ESPN's reported explanation sounded simple. The company had planned to speak with Ryan Clark privately on Tuesday, alongside other employees affected by restructuring, but that plan collapsed when information began circulating outside the building. Media inquiries were arriving. The story appeared ready to break. Executives faced an ugly choice: allow Clark to potentially discover his fate through social media, or tell him immediately even though he was still working on NFL Live. They chose immediately. From a corporate perspective, ESPN could argue that it was trying to prevent an even more humiliating outcome. From a human perspective, however, the result was almost impossible to defend. Clark reportedly learned that he was losing his position during the same show he was expected to help carry. That distinction mattered. This was not a commentator receiving a phone call at home. It was a former Super Bowl champion sitting under studio lights, surrounded by coworkers, with producers counting down the seconds until the program returned. One moment, Clark was part of ESPN's NFL coverage. Minutes later, he was gone. The network's decision also created a battle over language. Was he laid off as part of a restructuring? Was he fired because certain executives no longer wanted him? Did he voluntarily decide not to return after hearing the news? Or was he effectively instructed that his appearance was finished? Those questions became nearly as important as the separation itself. Clark later rejected any attempt to make the ending sound peaceful or mutually arranged. His account was direct. He asked whether he should be finished for the day, and the answer was yes. To him, that was not two sides calmly agreeing on the next step. It was the company telling him that the work was over. And once Clark began speaking for himself, ESPN could no longer completely control the narrative. The network had moved quickly because it feared a leak. But by acting during the show, it created a far larger story, one that transformed an internal personnel decision into a public debate about dignity, loyalty, and how powerful corporations treat the people who help build their brands. The $2 million target. Ryan Clark was not an inexpensive role player hidden deep inside ESPN's roster. Reports placed his annual compensation at roughly $2 million following the deal he reached to remain with the network in 2024. That salary reflected his value. Clark had become a major presence across ESPN's NFL programming, delivering strong opinions, emotional storytelling, and analysis based on 13 seasons of professional football. He could explain a defensive coverage, challenge a quarterback's decision, or discuss the human consequences of a violent game. But in corporate restructuring, a large salary can quickly change from evidence of importance into evidence of vulnerability. ESPN was not simply evaluating whether Clark was talented, the company was calculating whether his production, personality, and role justified the cost. After its football operations expanded, a commentator can be respected by viewers and still become expendable on a spreadsheet. That is the cold reality of major media. A $2 million analyst is safe when executives believe he is essential. He becomes exposed when the company suddenly has several people capable of performing similar assignments. Clark was prominent, but he was not the sole face of ESPN. He had influence, but he did not control the organization. He was highly paid, but he was not protected by the kind of overwhelming leverage reserved for the network's biggest commercial stars. This created a dangerous middle ground. Clark was too expensive to be treated as simple rotational depth, yet executives may have decided he was not irreplaceable enough to justify the premium. When companies begin cutting costs, that category can be the most dangerous place to stand. The timing intensified every suspicion. ESPN's first Super Bowl broadcast was approaching. Clark had been expected to remain an important NFL voice. Instead of building toward the biggest assignment in American sports television, he suddenly found himself outside the network. Money may not explain every part of the decision, but it explains why his name would receive serious attention, and the financial pressure became even more dangerous when ESPN added an entire collection of NFL personalities whose duties could overlap with his own. The merger that changed everything. Ryan Clark's exit did not happen in isolation. It came as ESPN reorganized its football operation, following a major transaction involving NFL media assets and the integration of personnel connected to NFL Network. That larger shift changed the value of every seat at the table. Before the integration, Clark occupied a clear position. He was a former player with championship credibility, television experience, strong relationships across football, and the confidence to challenge almost anyone on camera. But once ESPN gained access to additional NFL insiders, hosts, analysts, and established personalities, executives had to confront a basic question: how many people were now being paid to provide similar football content? Restructuring often sounds strategic in a memo. Inside the building, it means careers collide. One analyst's expertise overlaps with another analyst's expertise. One insider covers the same teams as another insider. Producers discover that multiple personalities can fill the same segment. Then executives compare salaries, contracts, audience response, chemistry, and long-term plans. Suddenly, being good is no longer enough. Reports indicated that the broader cuts affected both recognizable on-air figures and employees working away from the cameras. Ryan Clark became the headline because his departure happened so dramatically. But the restructuring extended far beyond one chair on NFL Live. That context is essential. Clark may have been the first major name associated with the changes, but he represented a much larger corporate calculation. ESPN was attempting to combine football operations, remove duplication, lower expenses, and establish a new hierarchy. In that hierarchy, every person needed a clearly protected purpose. Was Clark the central face of a franchise program? Was his analysis impossible to replace? Did his audience justify his salary? Did executives view his personality as an asset powerful enough to outweigh any internal friction? If the answer to even one of those questions became uncertain, his contract was exposed. The merger did not necessarily create every reason for Clark's exit, but it gave ESPN the environment and perhaps the cover to make a decision that might have been building for months. Because long before that commercial break, there were signs that Clark's relationship with certain people inside the network had become increasingly complicated. The tension behind the cameras. Ryan Clark built his television identity by speaking with conviction. That made him compelling. But it also made conflict almost inevitable. He was not hired to sound cautious. He was hired because he could translate the intensity of an NFL locker room into television. Clark challenged narratives, defended players, criticized decisions, and refused to pretend that every person analyzing football possessed the same experience. That bluntness occasionally created problems. One highly discussed moment involved Peter Schrager. During an on-air disagreement, Clark emphasized the difference between someone who had played professional football and someone who had not. The exchange became tense, attracted attention online, and reportedly remained significant to people inside ESPN even after attempts were made to move past it. On television, confrontation can generate ratings. Inside a workplace, the same confrontation can damage trust. Reports suggested Clark had already faced increased scrutiny before his departure, and that previous apologies or controversial comments had contributed to executive concerns, none of that automatically proves that one argument caused his firing. Large companies rarely make multi-million-dollar personnel decisions for only one reason. But when a network is already cutting positions, every past dispute becomes another line in the internal evaluation. Clark's supporters could argue that ESPN benefited from his passion for years, and then punished him when that same passion became inconvenient. His critics could argue that influence and salary come with an obligation to maintain professional relationships. Both interpretations can exist at once. The deeper issue was whether ESPN still viewed Clark as worth the complications that accompanied his voice when his role was clearly valuable. Executives could absorb disagreement. When the merger created overlap and the company began reducing expenses, the calculation changed. Talent, salary, redundancy, and tension were no longer separate issues. They formed one storm. Clark later suggested that his departure was more personal than the phrase corporate layoff implied. To him, the restructuring may have provided an easy public explanation for a decision certain people already wanted. That accusation gave the story a new center. It was no longer simply about an analyst losing his position. It was about whether ESPN had used a broad business strategy to conceal a much more targeted rejection. The layoff wave gets bigger. The morning after Ryan Clark disappeared from NFL Live, the story widened. Other names began emerging. Established broadcasters, analysts, insiders, and employees connected to ESPN's wider operation were reportedly affected. Some had spent decades building their identities inside the company. Others had recently signed agreements or appeared to have secure positions. The cuts demonstrated that Clark was not the only person caught in the restructuring, but the circumstances of his exit ensured that he remained its most visible symbol. A company can announce a strategic reorganization using polished corporate language. It becomes much harder to control the emotional reaction when audiences recognize the people losing their jobs. These were not abstract positions. They were voices viewers associated with Sunday mornings, breaking news, injury updates, baseball summers, studio debates, and years of daily sports coverage. Reports identified figures such as Cam Newton, Carl Rave, Tom Pelissero, David Lloyd, Stephania Bell, Bart Scott, and Charles Davis among those affected by the wider changes. ESPN leadership described the process as part of integration and organizational restructuring. People, behind every famous name were many less visible employees facing the same uncertainty without a large podcast, millions of followers, or prominent friends capable of defending them publicly. That human reality shaped Clark's first major response. He could have immediately released an angry statement aimed at ESPN. He could have attacked executives, exposed private conversations, or transformed the moment into a public war. Few people would have been surprised. After learning the news during his own program, bitterness would have been understandable. Instead, Clark turned his attention toward the others who had also lost their positions. He expressed love, prayers, and hope for people who had poured years of their lives into the company. His message acknowledged the pain of watching one door close while encouraging them to believe another could open. That response changed how many people viewed him. For years, Clark had been known for forceful arguments and emotional intensity. Now, at one of the most humiliating moments of his professional life, he chose empathy before revenge. But empathy did not mean silence. Clark still had much more to say about how ESPN had treated him, and when he finally told the fuller story, the conversation became deeply personal. Grace, instead of a scorched earth attack, Ryan Clark had every incentive to make himself the center of the story. He was the famous name. He had reportedly been informed during a broadcast. His exit generated outrage. Fans, journalists, former players, and media personalities were prepared to listen to anything he wanted to say. Yet his earliest public message focused on his former colleagues. That choice carried weight because Clark understood exactly what those employees were feeling. He knew the shock of realizing that a routine workday had become the end of a career chapter. He knew how quickly corporate language could reduce years of loyalty into a sentence about restructuring. By addressing the larger group, Clark presented himself not only as an injured individual but as someone capable of seeing beyond his own pain. The reaction spread through sports media. Former network personalities criticized the way ESPN handled the cuts. Linda Cohn questioned why Clark had been permitted to appear on NFL Live if the company already intended to remove him. Others argued that employees who had helped build major media institutions deserved more dignity at the end of their tenure. New York Post. The criticism was not merely about whether ESPN had a legal or financial right to terminate contracts. Companies make difficult personnel decisions constantly. The outrage centered on execution. Respect is often revealed in the final conversation. A private meeting, a clear explanation, and an opportunity to say goodbye would not have changed the outcome, but they could have changed how the outcome felt. Instead, the visual that remained was Clark leaving during a commercial break while the program continued without him. That image encouraged a broader discussion about independent media. High-profile commentators increasingly understand that network fame does not equal ownership. A company can provide a platform, salary, and audience, but it can also remove access with one decision. Clark, however, already possessed something ESPN could not take away. The Pivot podcast on his own platform. He did not need permission to describe the ending. There was no producer controlling the segment, no executive choosing the language, and no commercial break capable of cutting the conversation short. When he finally sat beside Fred Taylor and Channing Crowder to explain what happened, the anger mattered, but it was not the emotion that defined the episode. The moment that changed everything came when one of his friends asked him a simple question about regret. The question that broke him. Ryan Clark had survived 13 NFL seasons, violent collision, championship pressure, criticism, and years of television confrontation, but on his own podcast, one quiet question brought him to tears. Would he have done anything differently? The question could have led to a discussion about contracts. Clark could have criticized management, revisited controversial comments, or admitted that certain arguments had damaged his standing. Instead, his mind went somewhere deeper. He thought about the people who approached him in public. Aldermen, mothers, community members, and viewers who told him they were proud of how he represented them. That was the emotional core of his ESPN career. Clark had not simply wanted to become a successful analyst. He wanted people from his community to see someone speaking intelligently, confidently, and honestly on one of the largest sports platforms in America. As he explained what that approval meant, his composure disappeared. His voice weakened. The emotions he had controlled since leaving the studio finally surfaced. The pain was no longer about losing a salary or a television seat. It was about wondering whether the sacrifices, compromise, and battles had been worthwhile. His answer was that he would not change the journey if it meant preserving what his representation had meant to those people. The moment affected his co-hosts as well. It revealed a version of Clark that television debate rarely allowed viewers to see a man measuring his career not only through ratings, awards, or money, but through the pride of people who believed he carried part of their identity onto national television. Coverage of the episode described Clark breaking down while reflecting on his ESPN exit and the personal meaning of his work. Fox News. That vulnerability complicated the public image surrounding him. Critics had seen a loud analyst who sometimes pushed conversations too far. Supporters had seen a fearless former player willing to challenge conventional media voices. The podcast revealed both interpretations were incomplete. Clark was also someone who had spent years trying to belong inside a powerful institution, without losing the qualities that made him valuable. And according to his account, the ending forced him to confront an unsettling possibility. Perhaps he had changed parts of himself to remain accepted, only to discover that acceptance was never guaranteed. Fired, not quietly laid off. Ryan Clark eventually drew a line between ESPN's public framing and his personal understanding of what happened. He did not want the separation described as though he were simply one interchangeable employee caught in an impersonal wave. Clark said he believed he had been fired, not merely laid off, and suggested that the broader restructuring gave decision-makers an opportunity to remove someone they no longer wanted. That distinction changed the meaning of every earlier detail. The salary was no longer just a cost, it was leverage for those arguing he was expendable. The merger was no longer just an operational shift, it was a convenient environment for eliminating overlap. The dispute with Peter Schrager was no longer just an uncomfortable television moment, it became possible evidence of deteriorating internal support. The commercial break notification was no longer simply unfortunate timing. To Clark and some of his defenders, it looked like the final expression of a relationship that had already broken down. Recent coverage of his comments emphasized his belief that the decision was more personal than ESPN's restructuring language suggested. That remains Clark's interpretation. While ESPN's stated rationale centered on broader organizational changes, the Times of India, that difference must be understood carefully. Clark can truthfully describe how the decision felt and what he believes motivated it. ESPN can point to a wider group of cuts as evidence that the company was reorganizing without access to every private conversation. Outsiders cannot definitively prove the precise weight of each factor, but one conclusion is unavoidable. The way the decision was delivered magnified the damage. Had Clark been called into a private meeting before the program, the story might have remained another painful sports media departure, because he learned during the broadcast and did not return after the break. His exit became a symbol. It symbolized the fragility of corporate loyalty. It showed how quickly prominence can disappear. It reminded every analyst, player, and broadcaster that visibility does not equal security. Yet Clark did not leave empty-handed. ESPN controlled the chair, the studio, and the broadcast. Clark retained his experience, his relationships, his audience, and a platform he helped build independently. The network could end his employment, but it could not erase the trust he had developed with viewers or prevent him from telling his own story. Now, the final question is larger than whether ESPN made the correct business decision. What should athletes and media personalities learn from Clark's rise, his conflicts, and his sudden exit? And how can a painful ending become the foundation for something more powerful? The lesson behind the empty chair. Ryan Clark's exit from ESPN was not just a story about one analyst losing one job. It was a warning about power, preparation, reputation, and the danger of allowing any company to become the sole owner of your identity. From ESPN's perspective, the decision may have been business. The network was restructuring, reducing overlap, and deciding which personalities fit its future. But business decisions still have human consequences, and the way those decisions are delivered can define how an organization is remembered. A private conversation would not have changed Clark's contract status, but it could have preserved dignity. Leadership is not measured only by the decisions executives make. It is also measured by how they treat people when those decisions hurt. Clark's experience offers an equally important lesson for athletes and broadcasters. Talent creates opportunities, but talent alone does not guarantee protection. Strong opinions can build an audience, yet they can also create tension. A valuable personality must learn when to challenge, when to listen, and how to disagree without destroying relationships that may matter later. At the same time, no public figure should depend entirely on one network. Clark's podcast, relationships, experience, and loyal audience gave him something more powerful than a studio chair: independence. The smartest move for modern athletes is to build their own platform before they desperately need one. Own your voice, protect your reputation, save your money, and create opportunities that cannot disappear because one executive changes direction. There is also a human lesson in how Clark responded. He could have immediately chosen revenge. Instead, one of his first public actions was to encourage other people who had lost their jobs. That does not mean he ignored his pain or pretended ESPN handled everything perfectly. It means disappointment did not erase his compassion. Conflict will always exist in football, media, and business. But humiliation does not have to produce hatred. Losing a position does not mean losing your purpose. Sometimes the door that closes publicly forces a person to build something privately that eventually becomes even greater. Ryan Clark entered that studio as an ESPN analyst and left as a man facing an uncertain future. But his knowledge, credibility, and ability to connect with people walked out with him. A company controlled the broadcast. It never controlled the entire story. Do you believe ESPN made a cold but necessary business decision? Press 1 in the comments. Do you believe Ryan Clark was treated unfairly and deserved more respect? Press 2. Share this video with another NFL fan. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more NFL news, player stories, contract drama, and the powerful moments happening beyond the field.